We have a very interesting program this afternoon. I just want to say my name is Michael Moynihan. I direct the Green Project at NDN, and we are very pleased to be here under the auspices of Congressman Blumenauer, who has been a real leader on transportation and other issues over the years. So I just want to say a little bit about NDN and the Green Project, and then I will begin by introducing our speakers today. NDN is a progressive think tank founded by Simon Rosenberg that has identified a number of sort of cutting-edge issues that we work on. We have a very active program on the role of Hispanics in the electoral process, and Hispanics as a group of growing importance to American politics. We also have a project on the new tools of politics, and some of you may have... Does that mean... I understand the congressman has already voted, so... we have a project that some of you may be familiar with on new tools in politics, and we have been educating a lot of people active in electoral politics in how to use things like the internet, Facebook, search, and other new types of technologies, which we saw became so important in this last electoral cycle. We have a program on globalization and its impact across the globe and in the United States, and particularly making globalization work for all Americans. And finally, I head the Green Project at NDN. The Green Project is about a little over a year old now, and we are devoted to trying to forge links between people who are active in clean technology, the environment, and others, and the political process here in Washington, as together we build what we believe is going to be the low-carbon economy of the future. Just to give you a sense of where we are on this issue, we feel that building a low-carbon economy is not only good for the environment, but is also going to be absolutely critical to America's future going forward on an economic level. And in recent months, we have been looking specifically at the subject of clean infrastructure. In other words, how we build a physical plant, an infrastructure for the United States that is a 21st century one as opposed to a 20th century one. Much of America's physical plant was really built for an era of low-priced gas and low-priced energy. And although gas prices have come down in recent months, clearly the trend is upwards in terms of energy prices. So our belief, our very strong belief, is that we need to create policies and programs to create a new 21st century infrastructure for America. So one of the most important ingredients of infrastructure is, of course, transportation. And so we've convened this meeting today under the auspices of Congressman Blumenauer to talk specifically about transportation infrastructure. And of course, if you read the papers, as I'm sure you do, you're aware that there's a huge stimulus package which is currently under consideration that would do quite a lot in the area of transportation. And there's also a strong likelihood that we will see important new transportation legislation over the next year, in which we would imagine that Congressman Blumenauer will play a very important role. And clearly the major transportation bills that we've seen over the last decade have had a huge impact on our society, not only specifically in transportation, but also in shaping regional economic growth and our economy. And we have also invited today experts on regional economic growth and transportation to talk about that. So I'd just like to say a couple words about our speakers. In particular, I want to introduce Congressman Blumenauer, who is from first served in the Oregon House of Representatives in 1972. He has been a member of the House here since the 1990s and has played a very important role in shaping policies through his position on the Ways and Means Committee and recently on the new Select Committee, which has been formed to work on energy and related issues. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Congressman Earl Blumenauer.
Thank you very much, Michael. And it's a great pleasure to share the program with Chris, whose work I've admired and am intrigued with the program he's involved with that maybe he'll speak a little bit to, that talks about how we pull these pieces together at the University of Michigan. And in a prior administration, Bob Peck and I had a chance to plot and scheme a little bit to try and have the federal government lead by example. And the work that he did at GSA really was critically important. And I hope that with the new administration that there will be an opportunity for us to dust off some of those initiatives and to enhance them. Because the federal government is the largest landlord, landowner, and employer in the country. The Department of Defense is the largest consumer of energy in the world, and its inventory of infrastructure is almost beyond our ability to manage. GSA, I think, Bob, and we were working on some of these things, had an inventory of over 300 million square feet scattered around every major community in the country and a whole bunch of smaller but important areas as well. These are tools that are available to us at a time of fascinating opportunity. This stress, the economy's in free fall. Some of you may have noticed. But it is going to be an opportunity to fast forward things that we have been discussing in this room, on Capitol Hill, and a number of you are associated with members and organizations that have been moving forward on this. This is the opportunity to be able to align those forces and make a difference. I started working before a number of you were born on these issues, and the notion of livable communities was a good idea to strengthen neighborhoods. It was good for the local environment. It had some interesting economic opportunities, but it was kind of arts and crafts. It was something that was secondary. Maybe it was something that made sense in a left coast place like Portland, Oregon, but it's not exactly the meat and potatoes of public policy and activity. Well, we've watched as that has changed, where the notion about how we plan and organize our infrastructure, how we give people choices about where they live, how they move, and what the federal government incents through the tax code and our vast authorizing process, and most important, what the federal government does. This stuff has moved to center stage. It's gone from the interesting and the desirable to the important, and now, with the economic situation, energy instability, water stress, and, global warming, it's become critical. This is the only way that we will stabilize and provide a sustainable rebound for the economy while we protect the planet. Focusing on infrastructure and transportation is a critical point of departure. We have more and better infrastructure than anybody else in the world, but it's in sorry condition in a lot of places. The American Society of Civil Engineers has given us a D- rating in their last report card, and some of you would suggest that they rated us on a curve. The infrastructure isn't necessarily where we need it. And as we look around the world, we are losing a race with many countries, large and small, that are making major investments in infrastructure for the future. China, 16 times our gross domestic product investment? India, 9 times on a sustained basis. There was a front page article in the, was it the Sunday Times, talking about Dubai using their energy revenues to position themselves for a green and sustainable future. Dubai. I was proud to work to introduce the first modern streetcar back in Portland a few years ago. It took a long time. They're looking at it. They're bringing people from Portland, Oregon to talk about having a streetcar in the Gulf. We are walking into the first window of opportunity over the next 3 to 4 months. The stimulus package is not going to include everything that some of us would like, but it's a lot better than anything that I have seen in my tenure in Capitol Hill. It's got a wide range of incentives and infrastructure investments that are going to make a difference, and it's likely to be followed by a major initiative dealing with energy, where more good stuff is on the way. And as is referenced, we are going to be looking at a major reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act, T4. Some want it to be green T. But under the leadership of Chairman Oberstar, the subcommittee chairman, Peter DeFazio, they're already hard at work on the most significant transportation reauthorization since 1991. This is a window in this Congress where we will be moving forward on these elements to be able to jumpstart what we have to do as a country, as a society, as a world over the next 20 years if we are going to actually be able to meet the challenge that has been set to reduce greenhouse gases by 80% by 2050, which now appears to be the floor, not the ceiling. And with the feedback effects that we're seeing, it may well be that we need to be doing more for a whole host of reasons. But whatever that target is in 2050, what we do in the next 20 years will determine whether or not we change the shape of that curve. And in the next 20 months, whether or not we're serious, because we will never have a better opportunity than we have right now with the convergence of these forces. We're watching the American public be several steps ahead of us. Vehicle miles traveled, a critical indicator. And our friends at Brookings have put out, and maybe we'll hear a little bit more about it in terms of a great report, vehicle miles traveled that had been for years skyrocketing, increasing 3 times faster than population, twice as fast as vehicle registration, in a pattern that was clearly unsustainable, moving traffic shed after traffic shed to breakdown, posing problems of air quality, water quality, congestion, as we were sort of chasing our tails, and really just disrupting American families in terms of the amount of time and money that was spent just to get back and forth to work or the kids to soccer practice. Because of all, everybody had to drive. Kids couldn't walk or bike safely to school or soccer practice. The critical mass was something that was compounding the stress on American families while it was being a problem for the environment. Well, that about 2000, it looked like on a per capita basis that may started to level off. It's actually declining a little bit. And that is without massive change in government policy that created this dynamic in the first place. It wasn't an accident that the American love affair with the automobile was enhanced, where we saw these development patterns, where we saw families spend, in low-income families, actually spend more on transportation than housing, and it's the second largest expenditure for the typical American family. It was because of deliberate federal policies to incent that type of behavior. Free money for highways, but if you're going to expand the 2nd Avenue subway, you pay for that out of your own pocket. It wasn't a hard decision for most local officials and state officials in the 1960s to decide, well, we're going to go with the free money in roads. The only problem was it didn't much work. Well, we're seeing the public change. We're seeing the public realize that they want communities with sidewalks. Attached housing makes more sense for geezer baby boomers like me. Some of us in this room actually grew up in the Ozzie and Harriet era, where there were where half the families had children at home, and it was usually two, maybe three, two parents. No more. In fact, Chris Nelson has some fantastic research on the impacts of the demographic shockwave that we all should look at, because we're going to have, 430 million Americans by mid-century. Well before we hit that point, probably 2040, maybe sooner, we will have more single-person households than families with children. What are we going to do with 20 million McMansions that are scattered around the countryside? When too many communities are still rooted in the past, and sadly too many of our policies are rooted in the past. I've already probably talked longer than I should, but let me summarize with 2 quick points. One is we need to make sure that the reauthorization, the energy legislation, the tax legislation, the economic stimulus focuses on these longer-term problems, how we rebuild and renew America. We need to focus on that because that's actually where we will create more jobs. Fixing it first, and then transit and trails and bike paths. They create more jobs than a bridge to nowhere or just paving more out in the countryside. And it further will erode, as Chris and Bob can talk at great length, and I hope will, further erodes the value of existing neighborhoods and existing central cities, while it complicates the equation for us all. We need to make sure we have our eye on the ball in terms of getting the most economic impact out of this. And it's focused where we need it, and it's with the long term to deal with climate change and with carbon and job creation in a way that enhances the choices for communities and families. The last point, and I'll be talking more, and we maybe even cook something up at some point to talk about how we pay for all this. I've been in Congress 13 years now, and money didn't much matter when it came to tax cuts, what it did to the deficit. If it was a tax credit or a tax cut, that was kind of free money. Money didn't matter when it came to a war in Iraq. It's just on our grandchildren's credit cards. Thank you very much. Well, we're in a situation now where money matters a little bit, but you kind of wonder if you look at $8.5 trillion that we have spent or committed on bailing out the financial sector and trying to clean up this mess that relates to that. It looked for a minute like money didn't matter with $8.5 trillion. But we will have, $850, $900 billion real money towards targeted tax and infrastructure investments. And this will be our one chance where, for things that a lot of us really care about and have been working towards and that will have real value, this is a free shot. But starting next year, money matters. We're going to have to balance the books, deal with the fact that we have been living beyond our means, piling up debt. The Highway Trust Fund is in deficit for the first time in its history. It cost us $8 billion just to get through this fiscal year at the current level of programming. We're going to need a reauthorization that is $350, $400, $450 billion. Probably if we were smart and investing in the future, it would be $500 in terms of the partnerships that we need for the federal, state, governments, transit. How are we going to pay for that? Because we got to balance the books. So one of the things we're working on, we have some legislation that we'll be introducing with Senator Carper, Congresswoman Tauscher, that would take a portion of the cap and trade revenues and use it to rebuild our infrastructure in a sustainable, carbon-constrained fashion that will actually reduce carbon footprint. That will take some of the sting, because there will be some dislocations as a result of what we do in a carbon-constrained economy. And we'll look forward to talking with you about that. We'll also be proposing some legislation to fund the transportation generally in the short term. Two markers. One of it will be increasing the gas tax. I know that some people think that's politically awkward, dangerous. I've heard people tell me, by cracky, 3-cent increase per gallon for gas. It doesn't make a difference whether gasoline is $2 a gallon or $4.07 a gallon. It's just unacceptable to the consumer. The same consumer who will walk into the mini-mart where they just finished pumping the gas and pay on a per gallon basis $26.70 for bottled water that they could get out of the tap virtually for free with a higher degree of confidence of its quality. Well, it's about perceived value. It's about marketing. It's about how you work with the public. Well, that's what we're going to have to do when we deal with fuel taxes. And part of it, we will be proposing that we eliminate the gas tax in the course of the next 10 to 15 years, because we're in a downward spiral of fuel efficiency, God forbid. We're going to get more miles to the gallon. We're still going to have wear and tear on the roads. We're going to have congestion. We're going to need to deal with crumbling infrastructure, but we're not going to collect as much money. And it's going to get worse over time. We need to transition to something that is use-based and get out of the gas tax altogether. Cap and trade, use-based formula. We can do this. My final thought is that those of you who are here working on Capitol Hill, whatever your capacity, you got a chance to be a part of the action here in a way that I've not seen in my political lifetime. In Washington, D.C., you make your own reality, and we're in uncharted waters right now. And those of you who may be recent addition to new members of Congress, these are concepts that are going to be advanced and refined. There are lots of great ideas around here that are looking for champions and making sure that as we have broader pieces of legislation, that the good stuff gets woven into the tapestry of what is going to be, I think, a major new series of initiatives. And you've got a chance to make a difference, unlike any that you've ever had before and probably ever will in the future. And we look forward to working with you to exchange ideas, plot and scheme together to be able to make our communities more livable and our families safer, healthier, and more economically secure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I think what we might do right now is, if anyone has any questions for Congressman Blumenauer, why don't we take those right now in the event that there's another vote or whatever. Any questions? Yes?
Will the initial stimulus package, do you anticipate it containing any incentives to increase private sector participation in financing infrastructure projects?
Why don't you say who you are?
Sorry. Aaron Brown, Scandinavia. The question was, do you anticipate the stimulus package will include any proposals to incentivize private sector financing?
There are a series of challenges that we're facing right now. For example, in some of our energy arenas, we've been using tax credits, which are a little awkward if nobody has profits to offset. There is development of an initiative that I think is public knowledge, using some bonding capacity where the federal government would actually write down the interest rate, which I think has great potential. There will be infrastructure assistance to states, local communities, where there will be both money to them and some additional tools that are being experimented with. But the infrastructure itself that is likely to come out of this for transit roads, bridges, being able to repair bike paths, dare I say, are going to have a salutary effect for private developers. It's going to be a signal of value. It's going to help stimulate local economies, and I think it will have a significant ripple effect.
Other questions? Jack?
People are well aware of this situation. There is a commitment on the part of the administration and their spokespeople in our meetings. A number of the people on our Ways and Means Committee, those are the only meetings that I've been involved with that are in great detail on this, but people are aware they've been discussing precisely those types of remedies or finding other applications that may be possible in terms of the funding piece that I mentioned in terms of loans that where we may just actually write it down. But I'm confident before the bill is enacted for the stimulus that there will be a longer horizon for alternative energy. There will be an effort to try and regularize some of the treatment and be able to make sure that we get past this current trough that we're in for at least, 18 months at a minimum. That's going to be necessary to keep the industry moving forward and making the progress that we need to diversify energy supplies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. Okay, well, I'd just like to echo a few of the things that Congressman Blumenauer has talked about, and I'm going to just say a few words before we introduce our next speaker. The situation for infrastructure in the United States is truly dire. We have a broken system. Congressman alluded to the American Society of Civil Engineers rating of D- for our infrastructure, and the estimate of the amount of money that's needed to repair it is $1.6 trillion. So if you take a look at the big situation in the United States, we have in many ways, notwithstanding the current crisis, an incredibly dynamic system. We're very good at certain things. We're good at spawning new businesses, new industries. But as we look to our economic future, I think we have to recognize that other countries have become much better recently at creating the basis for future growth. And some of these great infrastructure investments that the United States has done over the centuries, the Hoover Dam, the internet, the interstate highway system, notwithstanding its impact on regional growth, have really powered waves of prosperity. But if we look at who is making those investments today that will power the next waves of global prosperity and will bring prosperity and wealth and well-being to the citizens of their countries, we cannot really point to the United States. The big investments are not being made here. They're being made in China, in India, in the Gulf. And so we have to kind of figure out what is it that we're not doing correctly and what can we do to improve it. Well, one of the problems is that our system of financing infrastructure is not working, and our system has been heavily biased in favor of earmarks and the annual appropriations projects, and we don't have a good system for undertaking large long-term projects of the type that we see in other countries. Also, on the private side, we have not really taken energy efficiency into our calculations. So, for example, and I think we're going to be talking about this in a little bit, much of the housing that was built during the recent housing boom was not really energy efficient housing. So as we go about creating a new 21st century economy, we have a tremendous opportunity. Certainly recognition of these issues has reached perhaps an all-time high in the United States. We have a new administration that has made this a priority. And we really have to go about creating a program to make these long-term investments and also get people to make private investments that are energy efficient and will create that high productivity, low carbon physical plant we need to proceed. As Congressman Blumenauer mentioned, the stimulus package that we're looking at basically reaching the floor of Congress in as little as several weeks, is really a once-in-a-century opportunity. This is a huge opportunity. But I just want to call your attention to what currently seems to be some of the things about the stimulus package that we might look at in terms of making it work a bit more effectively for the future. The stimulus package is very much about doing something to quickly stimulate the economy, but on the other hand, as we at NDN have argued, it has to work for the long term as well. So if you look at the way it's being structured, some of the investments will be long term, some of them, such as tax cuts, are designed to work in the very short term. But I think that there is a possibility that once this package is enacted, people may sort of stand back and say, as the boat leaves, and say, there it goes, and a year from now we'll evaluate how it works. So one proposal I just want to put forth before you today that we at NDN have been advocating on behalf of is that a portion of the stimulus be held back, if you will, in some form such so that we can perhaps make corrective changes and there can be some discretionary authority over the next year as we see how the money rolls out of the economy, so that if we need to make changes, if we need to fund new projects, that flexibility exists. So we are advocating that the board that the President-elect has suggested to supervise and also audit and otherwise oversee the stimulus package perhaps have reserved for it some amount of money that could be used on a flexible basis. So I just want to put that out there as something to think about as we go forward. Now, we're very lucky today to have commenting on the situation two real experts on transportation and regional economic growth that can add to what Congressman Blumenauer talked about a little bit earlier. So I first want to talk about Bob Peck. Bob is somebody who I have an association with through my family because Bob worked for Senator Moynihan in his career. He is a former staffer who has worked on transportation issues for many years and was critically involved in the very important ICE-T legislation, which created really a new paradigm for transportation whereby it was not as focused as it had been previously on highway transportation. Bob is currently managing director of Jones Lang LaSalle. He has been head of the Washington Board of Trade, and he really knows these issues inside and out. So I'd like to introduce Bob Peck.
Thank you, Michael. I have to say that Congressman Blumenauer, as always, sort of laid out the agenda about as well as it can be laid out, and also sort of gave us as much cause for optimism as you can have. He's right. I actually met him when I was running public buildings at GSA, and we had done something, not the brightest thing in the world, in Portland, which he didn't hesitate to call to our attention. And after I did a few mea culpas and accepted what, in fact, were his really good ideas, we forged a terrific relationship on helping to make federal buildings a little more friendly in their community. Let me go back a little bit in history. I'll talk a little bit about where we were, where I think we are, and where we are going in the short run, and I hope also in the long run with respect to a stimulus package and to a reinvestment in transportation and transportation infrastructure in the United States. And I'll do this quickly. I want to give you more bullets than anything else. But on ICE-T, which came around in 1991, one of the subterranean sort of sub-rosa goals of ICE-T, which Senator Moynihan articulated fairly well, but maybe didn't get picked up so much at the time, was trying to change the attitude in federal transportation funding from building structures, building roads, to moving people and goods efficiently, and that's why it was called Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. You know, a mouthful, but a good idea. So there was an idea that we would create more of a sense that transportation is a seamless structure, that it's intermodal, goes between highways and transit and airports and ports and where people live and where they work, and all that needs to be thought of as a single system. And then it was also an attempt, because as Congressman Blumenauer noted, if you follow the money, you find out why things are done a certain way, to try to level the playing field a little bit between the way transit was funded, which, as he noted, came out of general tax dollars, out of a politician's pocket, and put a little bit more on a level playing field, to where highways were funded mostly out of gas tax dollars, which didn't appear to be, didn't run the same risks for politicians, and in fact, highways got a higher proportion of federal funding. But as we also know, but I'm concerned, I have to say, in the current climate, that when you read reports about the stimulus package, and I'm not saying this comes from the president-elect's team or from what's going on in the transition, but the conventional wisdom seems to drive most reporters and broadcasters talking about this to talk about money for roads and bridges, because it's a context that we're used to. And there are, in fact, many forms of the bridge to nowhere. And I think we need to be cautious and careful that we don't fall into a good number of those traps. For example, even though it's been 18 years since Ice-T was passed, some states embrace the idea of intermodalism. Some states have more reason to embrace it. They're more urbanized, quite honestly, than others. And some states don't. But will we fund something else that we've talked about a lot more since Ice-T? Will we fund congestion pricing to make transportation more efficient? Ways in which we can use what transportation structures we have more efficiently, because there are different ways to make transportation clean and efficient. One, which we also hear a lot about, and it is a great idea, is to turn our car culture from the internal combustion engine more to electricity or gas or other clean fuels. But the other thing that we can do is to try to reduce the need to go to vehicles in the first place, because eventually we'll be talking about how much electricity and how much natural gas we're using in vehicles as well. So will we sort of get that? There were in Ice-T also, there was a push to try to make incentives and disincentives so that transportation funding would not just be used to satisfy a wish list, but to create, as I said, an intelligently designed system. I don't want to get into creationism versus evolution, but an intelligently designed system. But so many of the formulas still are based on highway mileage that people do respond to incentives in our system, and I don't think we've quite gotten those right either. And then one thing that I think that I will talk about, and I know Chris will as well, is that the flip side of transportation is land use. Now that's not one of the great issues of our time either when you say it, but the way in which transportation relates to, what that really means is the way transportation relates to the way we live and the way we work. Do the transportation options that we have encourage the Ozzie and Harriet form of development, or do they form a more compact form of development, which in and of itself saves land and gives us the opportunity to do what I said before, which is to make less use of whatever transportation vehicles and structures that we have to build. There was an attempt to do that in Ice-T. It was a bit watered down. It was a new concept. It was a little bit scary to people. It's still a key issue. Can we use smart transportation? Can we create the kinds of structures? Can we incorporate into our thinking about transportation the idea that if people live closer to where they work, and that's not so easy sometimes in a two-earner family because the earners go in different directions, but can we figure out a way to get people closer to where they work? Can we figure out a way that people don't have to hop into a car to go 5 miles to get a gallon of milk? Because as I have always said, if you look in this area, most of you I suspect live in this area, if you think about transportation patterns, some people can walk a couple of blocks and buy a gallon of milk, or baby formula if they need it, or, to be honest, grab a beer if you feel like grabbing a beer, and other people have to get into a car. So that if you look at the congestion that we have on our highways, and even in our mass transit, it doesn't necessarily all happen during what's called the peak traffic periods. There are times, I just suggest if you haven't, go to Rockville Pike on a Saturday afternoon, and you'll find that there are things that we need to do to buy which create unbelievable traffic messes with people sort of stuck in traffic, spewing lots of fumes. So can we create incentives, and will we spend some of our transportation infrastructure money on creating the sort of smart growth, transit-oriented developments that allow people to walk, to bike, to make use of ride sharing, car renting, the zip car, flex car use that we can see that works more in urbanized areas. And finally, I'll just say this is not an anti-suburban agenda, because what we're seeing in cities and metropolitan areas around the country is a tendency for there to become little urbanized activity centers in our suburbs as well. Finally, and I think these are big issues, and I don't know that we'll solve them today, tomorrow, or anytime soon, is how do we use the leverage of federal funds to make this shift in mentality? Because, and here we come into some very serious issues of federalism, of centralized direction versus devolved decision-making, whether the central government gets to make certain decisions or states and localities. But we have lots of issues, and Michael actually alluded to a number that I just want to put on the table, maybe we can talk about later. And that is, as we spend this money, let's make a couple of distinctions. One, there are certain projects that are shovel-ready, ready to go, but I can tell you from a near lifetime now in dealing in commercial real estate and transportation funding, there are blessed few of them. And many of the ones that are probably not the ones that, in the long run, you'd really go to. If you're talking about fixing certain structures, fine, but a lot of other projects are not really shovel-ready, because if they are long-term big projects and they haven't had funding now, they probably haven't had enough funding to make them shovel-ready today. So that's an issue. Number two, and this is the really big issue and gets us into whether we have central planning in our country or not, is to what extent, if we believe that we have an opportunity now to spend billions and billions of dollars on getting transportation right, to what extent, and we know that the mindset out there, in some cases, as Congressman Blumenauer said, is ahead, but not necessarily so in the state highway bureaucracies. How do we make sure that the federal money is spent in a way that we think in the long run does lead us to walkable environments, to the use of clean transportation, the opportunity to use less of what we've used to think of as transportation, but more of what we refer to as the ankle express, walking, biking, and those kinds of opportunities. In any event, it's a whole question of whether those things can happen, whether they can work on a rushed schedule, but I submit to you that they're key, and they're things that we really need to think about as this money goes out the door, and we don't have a lot of time to do it because we don't want to be accused of having held up this necessary spending in the name of getting everything perfect. We need to get it right, but not necessarily perfect.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you. And our next panelist, Chris Leinberger, is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. Anyone who works in the area of urban and regional studies, I think, is familiar with the exceptional work that Brookings has done in this area. Chris wrote a very influential article for The Atlantic not long ago, and also directs the University of Michigan's Real Estate Graduate Studies program. And he has done a great deal of work on the link between transportation policy and urban and regional growth, and particularly the increased really desire and demand, which perhaps is not being adequately addressed on a public policy level, for walkable communities. So I would like to now introduce Chris Leinberger.
One thing that was not mentioned is that I'm a real estate developer. And real estate development doesn't get heard very much from up here on the Hill. And it's important for two reasons. One is because real estate developers are hated more than any other institution in this country except for Congress. So you can always use us as a whipping boy to say, hey, at least there's somebody that's hated more. And the second thing is that real estate developers put in place 35% of the wealth of the country. 35% of the wealth of the country, of the assets in place, are comprised of your homes, this building, the roads in front of this building, the metro system, office buildings, retail. It is the largest asset class in the entire economy. And if you want to know how important it is, we are very proud to say that we in real estate have caused 2 of the last 3 recessions, including the one that we're in right now. How we are going to get out of this ditch means, or what it means is that we've got to get real estate out of the ditch as well. But the real estate market has fundamentally changed over the last 10 to 15 years. There has been a structural shift in how we build the built environment and what the market wants. It doesn't want Ozzie and Harriet, just as the congressman alluded to. What it wants is what is referred to as walkable urbanism. We've been building for the last 50, 60 years drivable suburbanism. It's been the de facto domestic policy of this country. One could argue it's the largest social engineering experiment in the country's history. But it's something for much of that time, we wanted it. This is not some communist conspiracy. Nobody held a gun to our head to force us to live like Ozzie and Harriet. That we wanted it. But somewhere back in the mid-90s, the market went and began to shift. And I know who did it, because most of you are sitting here. It's the bloody young people who said, we don't want to live in the suburbs anymore. We want to live in walkable urban places. It's also the baby boomers that are retiring. And it's not to say that we're going to throw away the suburbs. That's not the case. And in fact, Bob really alluded to this. It's the transformation of the suburbs, and there's still obviously demand for drivable suburban, but where there's pent-up demand, where there is a great need, is in walkable urban development. Now, what's the role of transportation in this? Transportation drives development. My friends at the Transportation Research Board, which is that they're having their conference here this week, they love it when I say this. That there are 15 categories of infrastructure in the built environment. Transportation is first among equals. It dictates the form of the built environment. If we get the transportation system right, the rest will probably follow. And so that's why there's so much attention on the transportation side of the infrastructure question and the transportation side of the built environment. Because right now, there's pent-up market demand for it, and right now, the mortgage crisis was probably, we don't have the numbers yet on this, but anecdotally it's pretty obvious that the mortgage crisis was caused by putting trillions of dollars of the wrong infrastructure and the wrong product in the wrong location. And the market doesn't want it, and they've marked it down in value and have crashed the financial structure of this country. Ultimately, we're going to look back on the last 15 years and the misallocation of infrastructure dollars and of private investment dollars in real estate as probably the last gasp of sprawl. So what do? Well, for one thing, we should learn from Washington, D.C., the region. Because believe it or not, the D.C. region is the model by which we are growing in this country. There are more examples here of where we're growing, how we're growing, than any other metro area in the country. 30 years ago, if you wanted to know how this country was growing, you needed to understand Los Angeles. 20 years ago, you needed to understand Atlanta. Today, it's the D.C. region. And the reason for that is that we have 30 regionally significant, walkable urban places that are either at critical mass or are emerging. 30. 20 years ago, we had 2, Georgetown and Old Town Alexandria. But now we have the greatest downtown turnaround story in the country here. Downtown DC 15 years ago, most of you weren't here, but it was a place that you wouldn't be caught dead in. Then again, you might have been caught dead in. Today, it is almost built out. One major parcel left, which is the old convention center site, which Hines has under control. And within 15 years, the greater downtown, which includes NOMA, down by the Navy Yard, the Southwest, it's done within 15 years. If you would have said that 5 to 10 years ago, they would have put you away in the padded cell. This is one of the most remarkable stories, but it's not just downtown and the downtown adjacent places, but it's Bethesda Town Center, it's Rockville, it's obviously Arlington. Arlington is a great model. It's the Portland of the East Coast. It's also places like Reston Town Center and a National Harbor. The interesting thing about these 30 places is that 70% of them are in the suburbs. So it's the transformation of the suburbs every bit as much as it's the turnaround of our downtown. And of those 30 places, 90% of them are transit served. And that's because transportation drives development. Now, there's a major green side of this issue. And that's because recent research that's been coming out has demonstrated pretty convincingly, and this is intuitive. This is one of those things that when you tell your mother says, I knew that, that folks that live in drivable suburban households use and emit 3 times as much energy and CO2 as those that live in walkable urban conditions. Again, it's intuitive. I live in DuPont Circle. Most days I am on foot going to Brookings, going to various other offices, or getting onto the metro to come up to the Hill. We have a 2-year-old Volvo. You can tell I'm a Democrat, I have a Volvo. And that we've got 5,000 miles on it, my wife and I. I mean, there's just no reason to get into the car. And we live in a attached, in a townhouse, so we have common walls. So we unintentionally share our heat with our neighbors. Condos even do it better. The greenest place in this country on a per capita basis is Manhattan. And we don't have to live at that kind of density to get that kind of greenness as far as carbon footprint. We would meet the Kyoto goals tomorrow if this country lived at that density, but we don't have to live at that density to achieve it. We can live like in Bethesda Town Center or within walking distance of it, or in Arlington or Reston Town Center. And the important thing is that the market wants it. It's not, I mean, nobody has to force people to do it. There's pent-up demand for it. The best way that you know that there's pent-up demand for it, and again, you young people wouldn't know this because you've grown up where DuPont Circle and downtown condos are $500, $600 per square foot. But the townhouse I live in DuPont Circle 30 years ago, in today's dollars, sold for $100 per square foot. Today it sells for $600 per square foot. 20 years ago, that was the value price alternative. If you wanted to get the most money for your, or the most house for your dollar 20, 25 years ago, you'd move to DuPont Circle, you'd move to Adams Morgan. You'd be living next to a crack cocaine dealer, but you get the most house for your dollars. Today, it's the most expensive real estate in the entire region. You compare it to Great Falls, say, which is where my brother lives, who happens to be a sprawl developer. Thanksgiving's a lot of fun. His house 20 years ago was worth about $200 a square foot compared to my townhouse at $100. Today, his house is worth $200 a square foot compared to $600 a square foot downtown. That's one of the best signs to demonstrate this fundamental change in what the market wants. So there's probably 20 to 50% of the households, depending on the metropolitan area, that want walkable urban, and we in real estate aren't producing enough of it. And it's going to take us a generation to catch up with the pent-up demand. So what do we do with it? Obviously, the economic recovery bill. It's not the stimulus, by the way. The transition folks I met with yesterday said it's the economic recovery bill, not the stimulus. And the transportation bill are obviously key to these issues. Because again, transportation drives development. And the thing that we need to understand, and I slightly disagree with Bob on this, but maybe it's more just an expansion of what Bob just said. The transportation bill and the economic stimulus bill, as far as its investment in transportation, the goal is not to move people. The goal is to create value, the means by which is moving people and goods. And we've got to make that switch in this country so that we realize that we need to create more ballpark areas and more NOMAs and more Reston Town Centers through the transportation investment, because that's where we're going to get great economic value created, and that value that's going to be created there can be captured to help pay for the system. There is no reason why and I'm standing here representing real estate developers will be at the table to figure out private sector ways to pay for the transit, because there's such tremendous value potential, value upside. One perfect example, down by the Navy Yard, within walking distance of where we are right now, a city agency sold 2 acres down there. 7 years ago, if you remember what the Navy Yard area was like, pretty nasty place, those 2 acres were worth, at best, $5 to $10 per square foot, as far as the value of those 2 acres. And you would park trucks on it behind high security fences, which is what the government agency did. 4 months ago, in this miserable market, the government agency sold it to a private real estate developer, one of the bigger ones in this town, Anchorage, for over $700 per square foot. A 70-fold increase in just 5 to 7 years. And the reason for it is because of the pent-up demand for walkable urban development. That's the power, and if we could capture a portion of that to pay for the transit, the real estate industry is more than willing to do that. So, 3 things that we need to address to make the walkable urban future happen. Number 1 is get the transportation system that the market wants in place, and that means transit, biking, and walking. If I had my way, we would not build another mile of road. We don't need it. It'd be wasted infrastructure. Number 2, we need overlay zoning districts on those walkable urban places. In that 1/4 to 1/2 mile radius around those stations, we need to upzone to take advantage of the transit and the need and the desire for high-density development around those transit stations. And number 3 is we need to manage those places through business improvement districts like Bob mentioned up in Portland, where we manage 24/7 to keep it clean and safe, run the festivals, bond for various infrastructure improvements. And again, the best model in the country is what Rich Bradley has done with the downtown DC Business Improvement District. Those are the 3 things that will allow us to meet the pent-up demand, and oh, by the way, will get us moving towards a green economy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. I just want to ask you, in your capacity as part of the real estate development industry, can you say that you don't need money from the TARP? Or okay. But anyway, okay. Okay, I want to thank our panelists and open it up to questions at this point. As the moderator, I want to take the prerogative of asking the first question. One thing that appears from what we've heard today is that the future of the U.S. Probably does not belong as much in suburban growth as it has and belongs more in urban growth. But yet the developers have often chosen to build in the exurbs, and one reason that is often cited is that it's simply easier to do it out there. You don't have all the participants, the oversight, and so forth. Is there any role for the federal government in trying to kind of move more towards an urban model of growth as opposed to an exurban one?
This is near and dear to my heart. There's a project, a new urbanist high-density project that we are just finishing up outside of Philadelphia. It's a small project, 120 units, high density, relatively high density, 6 times as dense as the neighborhood around it. We had, for a fluke of a lawsuit filed against this jurisdiction 25 years ago by a civil rights group, by a fluke, we happened to have the zoning to allow us to do it. So we weren't going into this jurisdiction to ask for a 6 times increase in the density. It was already there. It took us 7 years of torturous brain damage to get that building, or to get that project moving. And it is, by the way, the fastest growing, even in this miserable market, or fastest selling real estate project in the Philadelphia region. It cost us millions of dollars. What I think the feds can do is, with the transportation investment, a requirement is around the stations, you must engage in what I mentioned earlier, overlay zoning districts, to take advantage of the infrastructure that is being built. Another friend of mine outside of Philadelphia, who's on the steering committee of an organization I've founded of the progressive developers in this country, and we're lobbying for, we're part of the Transportation for America Coalition, lobbying for the transportation bill and for the economic recovery bill. He had a project on the main line at a train station to rebuild the train station and develop high-density product all around it on a surface parking lot. So it's not as if he was replacing any buildings. He was getting death threats from the blue-haired ladies on the main line if he was going to go forward with that project. Death threats. Now, he didn't take them seriously, but the point is that we need to encourage high-density development around these stations. And if the federal government's going to put money in, there must be ways for that investment to result in high-density, mixed-use, walkable development around it. So that's one way.
Okay, thanks. Yes, Bob.
In the interest of full disclosure, I should note that I work in the commercial real estate industry and also advise people who are doing transit-oriented development projects. But one of the things I wanted to say, and it goes back to the question that the woman from Skadden Arps asked, is that I think that the federal government could, to help encourage this kind of growth, make some transportation funding available to help fund transit-oriented development projects around transit lines. One of the problems we have in funding mass transit, I'm going to go away from what I said before, which is that to some extent we can fund walkable districts and not have to think about any kind of transit, but people still need to go from place to place. But one of the things that we have is when the Department of Transportation reviews mass transit projects, whether light rail or heavy rail, they make a forecast of demand. And I think our experience is that the demand forecasts tend to be somewhat static rather than dynamic, by which I mean that they take a look at how many people live along the rail line now, they take a very conservative estimate of how many people are likely to live along it later, and they underestimate, or they misunderestimate as the phrase probably goes, how many people will live along that line. Some part of transportation funding, that's why I talked about land use, needs to help work out those kinds of structures and give an incentive for people to build walkable, transit-oriented developments around the transit stations. The one thing that we know, and I spent time up here and I've worked in local government, is that we will never get the federal government in a stimulus program or anything else to tell a state what to do, or a city rather, what to do about its zoning, how to zone a certain area. We could, however, say that if you want this transportation funding, you're going to have to make easy to do the kinds of developments that go hand in hand with that kind of funding so that we maximize the investment which we put into those structures.
Okay, thank you. So let's open it up now to questions. Yes. Yes, great.
I tell you, I think we have to talk about, sort of take this straight on. There is a need for taking the funding, that things can't be based just on pay-as-you-go in the transportation system. There needs to be a distribution mechanism that says that people who don't have access to certain kinds of jobs or transportation or housing, as as other people do, get the benefit of the wealth creation that goes on in the other areas. So, and let me give you an example. Let me go back to the example I gave before. If you take a look at whether you can run a transit line out to a not so densely built up community, and you only make that the criterion, you're not going to send a transit line out to a less affluent community that was built, say, 30, 40 years ago, of people who live in single-family homes. Even if they're relatively close together, it won't be justified. We've got to have some kind of rule that says that those people aren't also going to be able to buy a car every couple of years, and they need access to transportation. In terms of mass transit, one of the things that we need to bite the bullet on, we all know this, there are no mass transit systems in the world that pay as they go, that get their money just from the fare box. New York City comes as close as any, and I think it's something like 65%. They're all subsidized. The ones in Europe that we all sort of love to talk about, because the train comes every 3 minutes or the bus comes every 30 seconds, it seems like, are subsidized. And that's, I think it's something that we really need to agree with, need to talk about.
Did you say that you were with Zach Wamp? Space, I'm sorry, because I know Zach Wamp, and I know Chattanooga is one of my favorite towns on the planet. I've done a lot of work down there. The issue needs to be divided into two answers. And let me answer the question you didn't ask, but it's always asked, which is, given the fact that walkable urban places, there's pent-up demand for it, the result is that the walkable urban places that exist are the most expensive places in the region. As I mentioned earlier, this has only happened in the last 20 years. The ultimate answer to it is more supply. We need more supply to drive down the price. There's no reason that townhouse in DuPont Circle should cost $600 a square foot. Half of the reason it costs that much is because of the dirt underneath of it. And there's a limit to how much dirt there is, because there's a limit to how many walkable urban places there are. So if we add more supply, the prices will come down. The reason is a shortage of supply and pent-up demand, which drives prices up. The other thing that we're going to do, or that we see happening, in this country, drivable suburban households spend 25% of their household income on transportation. 25%. The average for the country is 19%, but for the people that live in car-dependent households, it's 25%. Many times it's up to 40%. So there are people in this country that own a car to drive to work so they can afford to own a car to drive to work. It's not a great way to create wealth. Walkable urban households spend 9% of their household income on transportation. It's a 16% delta that if we could shift that into housing, into education, or into that totally un-American thing, savings, that's a lot of money that you're talking about. And so that's the ultimate affordable housing solution that applies across the board. As far as the rural question, first we have to recognize that in this country, 80% of us live in metropolitan areas that create 90% of the GDP. This is a metropolitan nation, and we have to invest where the money is being made, where the economy is growing. So what that means is that the rural solutions are going to have to be, just as Don said, have to be viewed as subsidies, and they're not going to be mass transit. They could be van pools and that kind of a thing for the elderly to get to health care and to their services that are required. But it's a different solution than the metropolitan solution. The metropolitan solution is transit, biking, walking. The rural solutions will be road-based, and they're going to have to be subsidized. But the money to subsidize it is going to come from the metropolitan areas. That's where the money's made in this country. And we had better invest in that part of our country if we ever want to have the money to subsidize the rural economies.
And I would just add that the rural economy and also the rural mode of living is one that is very green friendly. It's really the sprawl in between the urban and the rural that creates a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gases and so forth. So you see much less sprawl in places like Europe where you go directly from urban to rural. Next question. Yes. If I might just comment on that, there is a real question, and both Bob and Chris alluded to the fact that there is federal jurisdiction, there's state and local jurisdiction, and for many of these issues, the impact or the footprint of the federal government is not necessarily that great. For example, on local zoning issues. So really, we probably have to talk about changing the mindset of the consumer. But let me see who else would like to take that one.
First, I'd say just as Chris was saying that the mindset of the consumer is changing with respect to where people live, I think it's changing with respect to demands for energy efficiency and housing. Second, there are a lot of local jurisdictions that are now adopting green building codes. So no matter what you do, whether it's any kind of a development over a certain amount of money in the commercial industry, for example, in Washington, D.C. now, any building over a certain size by a certain year is going to have a certain LEED or other equivalent kind of a measuring mechanism attached to it. So I think you're going to see that coming. There are opportunities. Clearly, people have the energy utilities have been so loath because of the cost of adding new capacity, you know, that we have a utility system in which people are paid by the utilities not to generate more demand. There are cases in which you can get the utility to share the cost of weatherizing your house or upgrading to a more efficient boiler. So there are a lot of things sort of coming together to make that happen. One other thing I just say, and this sort of goes to that other issue I just wanted to throw out on the table, is that in terms of what the federal government can do, there is a need to think more holistically. You know, EPA sometimes is over here thinking about water and sewer, and transportation's thinking about transportation, and we don't have a mechanism so far, maybe Carol Browner will provide it in the White House, to think about those things together and how do we create a kind of an incentive and mechanism for communities and states to think about those things. But again, I'll say I think some of those things you're talking about are starting to come together. And Chris?
Next question? I think we have time for, say, 3 more questions. I would just say quickly that that's a very interesting proposal, and certainly some sort of a model code, and there are in fact model codes, might accomplish some of the same goals as an actual federal mandate. I just want to mention one other thing before I turn it over to our panelists. There has been some very interesting discussion in terms of financing vehicles for housing. For example, mortgages. Having a provision whereby you would have a kind of a cookie cutter means of financing these types of efficiency changes. And some of that stuff could perhaps be addressed nationally at the federal level by things that have a national impact, such as mortgaging language or particularly federally guaranteed mortgages. But let me turn it over to our experts.
Over the next year or two, real estate finance and real estate in general will be dealing with the tsunami of loan repricing. The next wave to hit is going to be massive foreclosures in the commercial property sector. So they're not going to be focusing on this. But once we get through that, once we reprice, and a lot of people feel a lot of pain, I believe the market's going to get there anyway. I don't think, and particularly on the commercial side, I've been on the board of a green investment fund in real estate, and the fund won't touch anything that's not LEED certified. And I think that's becoming the standard for most investment funds, or will be the standard very quickly over the next few years after we get through this mess. On the residential side, that's a different story, because many times homeowners are willing to sacrifice long-term savings for short-term lower cost. So I would love to find a way that we can, I mean, to me the government, whether it be federal or state or local, to me it's about building a corral. And you don't let people outside the corral, but inside the corral it's a free market. And I think the corral for the residential market should be that homes should achieve a certain energy level, and that's just the law. And so that we don't see, we just don't give consumers the option. It's sort of like seat belts. We don't give you the option not to have seat belts, and it's illegal to drive without your seat belt on. It's illegal to drive without a helmet if you're driving a motorcycle. It's a similar thing. We know it's cheaper if we build green. It only increases your cost by 2, 3, 4%, and it saves you money yearly from there on. I think there's national security reasons to do it. There's obviously greenhouse gas reasons to do it, and I think it's on the residential side that we're going to have to look at that. I think on the commercial side, the market may take care of it itself.
Other questions? Yes. Just two quick comments on your first point. There should be a natural gradient between where jobs are located and where you live, such that if you live further away from your job, you should pay less for your housing to compensate for transportation. You're absolutely right. That's not recognized by mortgages, and I don't know that there are any great proposals out there, but it should be an area for further thought. Secondly, we at NDN have a proposal to green the federal government, and clearly putting things like transport-oriented development into the overall plan for the space needs of the U.S. government should be a part of that. I understand that there is going to be quite a lot of fairly aggressive set of executive orders coming out of the administration in this area, and we're hopeful that many of these things will be addressed.
All right. First of all, I would just note that NIH was not under GSA's jurisdiction, so I couldn't influence the campus. But I'll give you a counterpoint and then a more general point. Let me just answer your federal question. I let Chris talk a little bit more if he cares to about how mortgages are underwritten and whether we can get the transportation costs considered. But you are right. There have been, since at least the Carter administration, executive orders that require federal agencies to locate downtown or in urban areas. They are honored. To be perfectly honest, neither GSA nor anyone in the federal government seems to have the power actually to make that happen as much as it might, because heads of federal agencies generally have greater influence than anybody else about where their agencies go, and they tend to, like private sector CEOs, often determine their location by proximity to where they live rather than to where a metropolitan area might want people to go. But I'll give you a counter example that makes your point. The Southeast Federal Center, now being redeveloped, was at one time planned as a federal office campus. And one of the things that we did at GSA with great support from Congresswoman Norton was to turn it into a mixed-use public-private development where people will live, shop, and using the Department of Transportation as an anchor development have helped sort of turn that into a place. And I think that's the sort of thing that needs to happen. I hope that, quite honestly, the same thing can happen if the Department of Homeland Security is, in fact, going up to St. Elizabeth's, where it also needs to be an urbanized environment to take great advantage of that. One other point I'll just make is that I know we've turned a lot of this transportation on its head into a discussion of real estate development. But one of the things that Senator Moynihan taught me was that there was a huge difference in this country over the issue of air pollution when we were able to figure out a way to measure it. When you could pick up the phone, call the weather, and every day they told you that the air pollution index was 92. They used to do this, remember, or 95, and we have red alerts and all that. It made a difference. Every day you could measure whether you're getting better or worse, and an index counts. The LEED, Green Globe, and other kinds of measures we're getting for building sustainability and greenness are also important because they allow people to have some sense. They're generally flexible and allow you to use different initiatives. The one thing I'd say that those measures are just getting into are measures of location and transportation and whether they generate transportation or not. That's a very important issue for all of us in creating the kind of environment we're talking about.
Bob, one of my research projects at Brookings is to create a measurable way of measuring the market viability and the social equity of walkable urban places, because we do need, if we don't measure it, we can't figure out if we're doing the right thing. As far as the mortgage, we obviously have a great example that has floundered in the last few years because Fannie Mae was attempting to put it in place, and that's the location-efficient mortgage. Scott Bernstein, the Neighborhood Technology Center out in Chicago, developed it, and it does provide more flexibility for Fannie Mae to exceed their limits of family income that can go into a mortgage if you live near a transit or bus line. And so we do have we have 5 or 6 years worth of examples in Chicago, Los Angeles, and I forget where it was back east, where Fannie Mae tried this, but we absolutely need that. And just so you know the power of this, shifting that 16% of household income, let me make it more graphic for you, that in 2007, the average car, according to the AAA, to own and operate cost $7,800 per year. That's a Camry, or Focus, hopefully, driving at 15,000 miles per year. That $7,800 per year translates at a 6% mortgage rate, and today mortgage rates are down to 5%. At a 6% mortgage rate, that translates into $150,000 worth of mortgage if you drop that car out of your household. It's a huge factor. It's because of the tax deductibility of a mortgage interest, and it's just, you know, leveraging it over a 30-year loan. And so shifting that 16% not only creates a more green environment, it also shifts your spending from an absolutely depreciable asset to, hopefully, a appreciable asset, your home. And that's the way to build wealth in this country. I mean, that's the first thing to do to build wealth for households, is to have them own their home. And the best way to do it is to use that 16%, but we need to allow. And by the way, going back to your second question about the GSA and the government, you know, the government has tremendous resources that they could take advantage of. My development firm attempted a joint venture with NASA out in the Bay Area at Moffett Field. Moffett Field is about 200 acres on the bay, 2 exits of the Bayshore Freeway, the 101 freeway, and 2 transit stops coming out of San Jose from the light rail. And all these high-powered scientists working for NASA, including my favorite guy, who was, by the way, the director of space. He said, you know, I start daydreaming and planets start falling out of the sky. It's a very important job. And here these folks on government salaries have to commute 2 and 3 hours a day because they can't live in the mid-peninsula. And they have 200 acres of underused land that could be converted into a mixed-use project where they could walk to work and have great discussions with their colleagues going back and forth from work. So those campuses are great resources as well.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming and attending our event. This has certainly been a good learning experience for me, and I think for all of us here. Indiana is going to be holding more events on the subject of clean infrastructure as we go forward, on the stimulus and on the transportation bill, which is likely to occur this year. So we hope to stay engaged with all of you, and thank you again for coming. Thank you to our panelists as well.
We'll talk about real estate. Thank you. I'm sorry. It's your fault.